Welcome back to Crazy HOA Moments. This is one of those stories. I am standing in my driveway in Boston with my hands up trying to explain that my boat cover is not a violation when Sandra Young from the Meadow Terrace HOA Neighborhood Watch cuts me off and says, "We do not make exceptions, and I will enforce it." She is waving her phone camera at my boat like she is documenting a crime scene and telling me I have 24 hours to remove the cover or they will tow the entire trailer. I work in cybersecurity, and I am not looking for drama. I moved here because I wanted a community with amenities and I thought the standards would protect me from chaos, but right now Sandra is treating a boat cover like it is a biohazard and I have no idea how this escalated so fast. The first sign of trouble was 3 days ago when I logged into the HOA portal and saw a post with a photo of my driveway and a hearing date already set for tonight without any prior warning. Sandra is still talking, jabbing her finger toward the cover and repeating that it is unsightly and prohibited under Section 12 of the standards. I ask her to show me where it says that because I read the standards twice before I even bought the boat and there is nothing about covers being banned. She pulls out her tablet with the HOA portal open and neon sticky notes stuck all over the edge, and she scrolls to a paragraph about vehicles and says, right here, recreational vehicles must be stored in a manner consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. I point out that it does not say covers are banned and she cuts me off again with, "That is confidential. I have everything I need." Then she turns and walks back toward her townhouse across the street, and I am left standing there with my heart pounding because I have no idea what confidential even means in this context. That night I sit at my kitchen table and go through every page of the Meadow Terrace HOA standards document. I have the PDF open on my laptop and I am highlighting every mention of boats, trailers, driveways, and aesthetics. Section 12 says recreational vehicles and boats on trailers may be parked in driveways provided they do not obstruct sidewalks or mailboxes and are stored in a manner consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. There is no definition of what aesthetics means, and there is zero mention of covers being prohibited. I take screenshots with timestamps and save them in a folder labeled evidence. Then I check the portal again and I see that Sandra posted an update saying a formal violation notice will be delivered tomorrow morning, and the cure period is 24 hours from delivery. I call my friend Eric, who works in property management, and I ask him if an HOA can just invent rules that are not in the standards. He laughs and says they try it all the time, but it does not hold up if you push back with documentation. He tells me to gather every piece of proof I have, get timestamps on everything, and be ready to show that the standards do not support the claim. He also says he is willing to testify at the hearing if I need a witness who knows how covenant enforcement actually works. I thank him and hang up, and then I go outside with my phone and take time-stamped photos of the boat from every angle showing that the cover is clean, the trailer is within my property lines, and there is no obstruction of any kind. The next morning I am making coffee when I hear a knock at the door. I open it and there is a woman I have never seen before holding an envelope with the HOA logo printed on the front. She hands it to me without a word and walks back to a sedan parked at the curb. I open the envelope right there on the porch, and inside is a violation notice on Meadow Terrace HOA letterhead. It says I am in violation of Section 12 for displaying an unsightly boat cover in my driveway, and I have 24 hours from the time of delivery to cure the violation or face fines starting at $200 per day and potential towing of the trailer. At the bottom it says the hearing is scheduled for tonight at 7 in the community center meeting room and attendance is mandatory. I immediately text Eric and tell him about the notice, and he replies that 24 hours is absurdly short and probably not enforceable, but I should still show up prepared. Then I go back to my laptop and I start pulling every document I can find. I download the full standards PDF again and I notice the file metadata says it was last modified 4 weeks ago. I check the portal history and I see that the board posted an updated version of the standards last month with a note that all enforcement moving forward would follow the new version. I open the updated document and I find Section 12, and it now includes a sentence that was not there before. It says covers and tarps are permitted provided they are in good repair and do not display commercial logos or offensive imagery. I read that sentence 3 times to make sure I am not hallucinating. The updated standards explicitly allow covers. I screenshot the updated section with the modification date visible, and I add it to my evidence folder. Then I go back through the portal and I find the post where the board announced the update, and Sandra Young left a comment saying she reviewed the changes and approved them. She approved a rule that allows covers, and now she is trying to fine me for having one. I feel my blood pressure spike, but I also feel a strange sense of calm because I know I have her. I spend the rest of the day organizing everything into a tab binder. Tab 1 is the original standards with Section 12 highlighted. Tab 2 is the updated standards with the new sentence highlighted. Tab 3 is the portal post announcing the update with Sandra's comment. Tab 4 is my timestamped photos of the boat. Tab 5 is a printout of the violation notice. I also set up my phone to pull the doorbell footage from the day Sandra first came to my driveway because my camera caught the entire conversation, including her saying that is confidential. I have everything I need. I do not tell anyone about the footage yet because I want to save it for the right moment. At 6:30, I drive over to the community center and I see Sandra's car already parked near the entrance. I grab my binder and I walk into the building, and the meeting room is set up with a long table at the front and rows of chairs facing it. Sandra is sitting at the table with 2 other board members I recognize from neighborhood events, and there is a speakerphone in the middle of the table. She looks up when I walk in and she gives me a tight smile and says, "I am glad you could make it. We have a lot to discuss." I sit down in the front row and I set my binder on my lap, and I do not say anything yet. At 7 exactly, Sandra calls the meeting to order and she says the board is convened to address a violation of Section 12 involving my property. She starts reading from her notes and she says my boat cover is unsightly and does not meet the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood, and I have been given 24 hours to remove it or face escalating fines. One of the other board members asks if I want to respond, and I say yes, and I open my binder to tab 1. I read the exact language of Section 12 from the original standards and I point out that it does not prohibit covers. Sandra interrupts and says the board has discretion to interpret aesthetics and she has received multiple complaints from neighbors. I ask her to name one neighbor who complained and she says that is confidential and I have no right to know who filed the complaints. I flip to tab 2 and I slide a copy of the updated standards across the table. I say the board approved an update last month that explicitly permits covers, and I would like to know why I am being cited for something that is now allowed. Sandra picks up the paper and her face goes pale. She stares at it for a few seconds and then she says the update is not relevant because my violation was filed under the old standards. I ask her when exactly the violation was filed and she hesitates, and then she says 3 days ago. I point out that 3 days ago was well after the update took effect and she has no legal standing to enforce a rule that no longer exists. One of the other board members leans over and whispers something to Sandra and she shakes her head and says we still have the right to enforce aesthetic standards on a case-by-case basis. I flip to tab 3 and I show them the portal post with Sandra's own comment approving the updated standards. I say she cannot approve a rule and then pretend it does not apply when it is inconvenient. The room goes quiet and I can see Sandra's jaw tighten. Then the speakerphone crackles and a man's voice says, "This is Jonathan Reed. I am the attorney for the HOA. Can someone explain what is happening here?" Sandra leans toward the speakerphone and she starts explaining that I have been cited for an unsightly cover and I am refusing to comply. The attorney asks if the standards explicitly prohibit covers, and Sandra says no, but the board has discretion. The attorney asks when the violation notice was issued and Sandra says 3 days ago. There is a pause and then the attorney says, "I am looking at the portal right now and I see the standards were updated last month to allow covers. Is that correct?" Sandra says yes, but she does not believe the update applies in this case. The attorney says that is not how covenant enforcement works, and if the board approved an update then it applies to all enforcement actions moving forward. His tone has completely changed, and I can tell he is trying to distance himself from whatever Sandra thought she was doing. Sandra is gripping the edge of the table and she says she has photographic evidence that my cover is unsightly and she has the right to protect property values. I raise my hand and I say I also have evidence and I would like to present it. The attorney says go ahead, and I pull out my phone and I connect it to the TV mounted on the wall using the HDMI cable that is already there for presentations. I open my doorbell footage and I play the clip from 3 days ago when Sandra came to my driveway. The room watches as Sandra points at my boat and says it is unsightly and prohibited, and I ask her to show me where and she says that is confidential. I have everything I need. The footage is crystal clear and you can hear every word. When the clip ends, I say I want to make it clear that I asked for documentation and I was told it was confidential, and now I am being threatened with fines and towing for a rule that does not exist. The attorney is silent for a moment and then he says, "Sandra, did you review the updated standards before you filed this violation?" Sandra says she did, but she did not think the cover provision applied, because the cover is still unsightly in her opinion. The attorney says opinion is not enforceable and the standards are the governing document, and if the standards allow covers, then there is no violation. He says the board needs to withdraw the notice immediately and issue a written apology. Sandra's face is bright red and she says she is not apologizing for doing her job and protecting the neighborhood. The attorney says this is not protecting the neighborhood, this is exposing the HOA to liability, and if I decide to file a complaint with the state or pursue legal action, the board will lose. One of the other board members says we should vote to withdraw the notice, and Sandra says absolutely not. The attorney says he is advising the board in his professional capacity that continuing this enforcement action is indefensible, and he will not represent the HOA in any lawsuit that results from it. Then there is a click, and the speakerphone goes silent, and I realize he just hung up. The two other board members exchange glances, and one of them says we need to vote and the other one nods. Sandra says this is not over, and I have proof that the cover violates the spirit of the standards even if the letter allows it. I close my binder and I say I have one more thing, and I pull out tab 5, which is the email thread I printed from my camera timeline. I hand it to the board and I explain that this is the portal history showing every interaction Sandra had with the updated standards, including her approval comment and her subsequent decision to ignore the update when it did not suit her agenda. The board member who called for the vote looks at the printout and then looks at Sandra and says, "You approved this rule, and then you filed a violation for the exact thing the rule allows. What were you thinking?" Sandra stands up and she says I was thinking about property values and community standards and setting an example so people do not think they can do whatever they want. She says the neighborhood is turning into a parking lot for boats and RVs and someone has to draw a line. I stay seated and I say the standards already draw the line, and I am following them, and if she wants to change the rules, she can propose an amendment and put it to a vote like everyone else. Sandra looks at me and she says we do not make exceptions, and I will enforce it. And I say you cannot enforce a rule that does not exist, and your own attorney just told you that. The vote happens right there, and both board members vote to withdraw the violation notice and issue a written statement that my boat cover is compliant with the current standards. Sandra votes no, but she is outvoted 2-1. One of the board members says they will email me the written withdrawal tonight, and it will be posted to the portal as well. Sandra grabs her tablet and she walks out of the room without another word. I sit there for a minute, letting the adrenaline drain, and then I thank the board members and I leave. When I get home, I check my email and the withdrawal letter is already there. It says the board has reviewed the updated standards and determined that my boat cover is in compliance and no further action is required. It also says the 24-hour cure demand is rescinded and no fines will be assessed. I forward the email to Eric and he replies with a thumbs up and says I handled it perfectly. Then I go outside and I look at my boat sitting in the driveway with the cover still on, and I feel a weird mix of relief and exhaustion. The next morning, I wake up to a notification on my phone, and I see that Sandra posted something on the portal. I open it, and it is a long rant about how some residents think they are above the rules, and how the neighborhood is declining because people are not held accountable. She does not mention my name, but it is obvious she is talking about me. I screenshot the post and I add it to my evidence folder just in case, but I do not respond. A few hours later, I get a message from one of the other board members saying they removed Sandra from the neighborhood watch liaison role, and she will no longer have authority to issue violation notices. The message says the board is implementing a new review process to prevent this kind of situation in the future. I think that is the end of it, but 2 days later I come home from work and I see Sandra standing in my driveway with a tape measure. She is measuring the distance from my boat trailer to the street, and she is writing notes on her tablet. I get out of my car and I ask her what she is doing, and she says she is conducting a visibility inspection to determine if my boat obstructs sightlines for drivers. I tell her the board already cleared me, and she says this is a separate issue under the traffic safety section of the standards. I ask to see the section and she says she does not have to show me anything and I can wait for the formal notice. I pull out my phone and I start recording, and I say I am documenting this inspection for my records, and I would like to know what specific standard you believe I am violating. Sandra looks at the camera and she says you are not allowed to record me without my consent, and I say we are on my property and you are conducting official HOA business, so I have every right to document it. She puts the tape measure away and she says I will be hearing from the board soon, and then she walks back to her car. I save the video and I send it to Eric with a message saying she is escalating again. Eric calls me that night and he says Sandra is clearly trying to find any excuse to go after me and I need to be ready for whatever comes next. He suggests I reach out to the board directly and let them know what happened so they are not blindsided if Sandra tries to file another violation. I email the 2 board members who voted to withdraw the first notice, and I attach the video of Sandra measuring my driveway. I explain that she claimed to be doing a visibility inspection, and I would appreciate clarification on whether this is an official board action or something she is doing on her own. One of the board members replies within an hour and says Sandra is no longer authorized to conduct inspections, and they will address it with her immediately. The next day, I get a call from a number I do not recognize, and when I answer, a man says this is Jonathan Reed. I am calling on behalf of the Meadow Terrace HOA. I recognize the voice from the speakerphone, and I say I remember you from the hearing. He says he wants to apologize for the confusion, and he has advised the board to send me a formal letter confirming that my boat is compliant, and no further inspections or notices will be issued. He also says Sandra has been removed from all enforcement activities, and the board is considering additional steps to address her conduct. I thank him, and he says if I receive any further harassment from Sandra, I should contact him directly, and he will handle it. I think that is finally the end, but a week later, I get a certified letter in the mail from an attorney I have never heard of. I sign for it, and I open it, and it is a demand letter on behalf of Sandra Young personally, not the HOA. The letter says I have defamed her character by recording her without consent and posting false statements about her on social media, and she is demanding a written apology and $5,000 in damages or she will file a lawsuit. I read it twice to make sure I am not missing something, and then I start laughing because I have never posted anything about her on social media and I only recorded her on my own property during an inspection she initiated. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama. I call Eric and I read him the letter and he says it is a bluff and Sandra is trying to intimidate me into backing down. He says I should respond through an attorney and make it clear that I have documentation of everything, and if she wants to go to court, I will countersue for harassment. I ask him if he knows anyone who handles this kind of thing, and he gives me the name of a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes. I call the lawyer and I send over all my evidence, including the doorbell footage, the email thread, the portal history, the board withdrawal letter, and the video of Sandra measuring my driveway. The lawyer reviews everything, and he says Sandra's demand letter is baseless, and he will draft a response. 2 days later, the lawyer sends Sandra's attorney a letter explaining that I have never posted anything about Sandra on social media. The recording was made on my own property during an official inspection, and Sandra's conduct constitutes harassment under state law. The letter also says if Sandra proceeds with a lawsuit, I will file a counterclaim for defamation, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and I will seek attorney fees and punitive damages. The lawyer copies the Meadow Terrace HOA board on the letter, so they are aware of Sandra's actions. I do not hear anything back from Sandra's attorney. A week goes by and I start to feel like maybe it is actually over this time. Then I get a text from a neighbor I barely know saying she saw Sandra at the community center last night trying to get signatures on a petition to ban boat covers. The neighbor says Sandra claimed the board was allowing dangerous and unsightly conditions and residents needed to take action. I thank the neighbor for letting me know, and I forward the text to the board. One of the board members replies and says they are scheduling a special meeting to discuss Sandra's continued interference, and they may pursue formal action to remove her from the HOA entirely. The special meeting happens 3 days later, and I am invited to attend as a witness. I bring my binder with all the updated evidence, including the demand letter and the lawyer's response. The meeting is in the same community center room, and this time there are about a dozen residents in the audience. Sandra is sitting in the back row with her arms crossed, and she does not look at me when I walk in. The board president opens the meeting, and he says they are here to address ongoing harassment and interference by a former board member, and he wants to hear from everyone involved. I present my timeline starting with the original violation notice and going through the doorbell footage, the updated standards, the board withdrawal, the driveway inspection, the demand letter, and the petition. I show the board copies of everything, and I explain that I have tried to comply with the standards at every step, and I have been met with escalating retaliation. Eric is on speakerphone as a witness, and he confirms that Sandra's tactics are not consistent with standard HOA enforcement, and they cross the line into harassment. When I finish, Sandra raises her hand and she says I am twisting the facts and she was only trying to protect property values. The board president asks Sandra to explain why she continued to take enforcement actions after she was removed from the neighborhood watch roll. Sandra says she was acting as a concerned resident and she has every right to document violations and advocate for the community. The president says documenting is one thing, but conducting inspections and issuing threats is another, and she was explicitly told to cease all enforcement activities. Sandra says the board is enabling rule breakers, and she refuses to stand by while the neighborhood declines. One of the other residents in the audience raises her hand and says she signed Sandra's petition because Sandra told her my boat was blocking the street and creating a safety hazard, but after hearing the facts, it sounds like Sandra lied. The board president asks if anyone else signed the petition under similar circumstances, and 3 more residents raise their hands. Sandra's face is bright red, and she says she did not lie. She presented the facts as she understood them. The president says the facts are documented in the standards, and Sandra had access to the updated version and she chose to ignore it. He says the board is voting tonight on whether to recommend Sandra's removal from the HOA membership under the clause that allows expulsion for conduct detrimental to the community. Sandra stands up and she says, "You cannot expel me for enforcing the rules," and the president says, "We are not expelling you for enforcing the rules. We are expelling you for harassment, misrepresentation, and abusive process." The vote happens and it is unanimous. The board recommends expulsion, and the matter will go to a full membership vote at the next annual meeting. In the meantime, Sandra is banned from all HOA facilities, prohibited from serving in any volunteer role, and required to cease all contact with me or any other resident regarding enforcement matters. Sandra grabs her bag and she storms out of the room, and I hear her car start in the parking lot a minute later. The president thanks me for my patience, and he says the board will issue a public statement clarifying the standards and explaining the situation so other residents are not misled. That night, I get an email from the board with a draft of the public statement, and they ask me to review it for accuracy. The statement says the board recently addressed a series of enforcement actions taken by a former volunteer that were inconsistent with the updated standards and constituted harassment of a compliant resident. It says the board has taken corrective action, and all residents are encouraged to review the current standards posted on the portal. It also says any future concerns about compliance should be directed to the board through the official process, and residents should not attempt to conduct their own inspections or enforcement. I reply and say the statement looks good, and I appreciate the transparency. The statement gets posted the next day, and I see a bunch of comments from neighbors saying they had no idea this was happening, and they are glad the board took action. A few people reach out to me directly to apologize for signing Sandra's petition, and I tell them it is fine, and I understand how convincing she can be. One neighbor says she always thought Sandra was too aggressive, but she did not want to get involved, and now she wishes she had said something sooner. I tell her I appreciate the support, and I am just glad it is resolved. A month goes by, and I do not hear anything from Sandra. The annual meeting is scheduled for next week, and the membership vote on her expulsion is on the agenda. I get a call from the board president, and he says Sandra's attorney contacted him and said Sandra is willing to resign voluntarily if the board agrees to drop the expulsion vote and seal the records of the disciplinary proceedings. The president asks what I think, and I say I do not care if she resigns or gets expelled as long as she is gone, and I do not have to deal with her anymore. The president says he feels the same way, and the board is inclined to accept the resignation to avoid dragging it out. The resignation happens, and the board sends an email saying Sandra Young has resigned from the Meadow Terrace HOA and is no longer a resident of the community. The email does not go into details, but it says the matter is closed and the board appreciates the patience and cooperation of all residents during the process. I see a for sale sign go up at Sandra's townhouse 2 days later, and I feel a huge weight lift. I do not know where she is moving, but I hope it is far away, and I hope her next HOA has better oversight. I spend the next few weeks just enjoying the fact that I can park my boat in my driveway without looking over my shoulder. I take it out on the water twice, and both times I come home and pull it back into the driveway and put the cover on, and nothing happens. No violation notices, no inspections, no angry texts. It feels normal again, and I realize how much stress I was carrying without even noticing. Eric stops by one weekend and we sit on my porch and he says he is proud of how I handled everything and he has seen people crumble under way less pressure. A couple of months later, I get an email from the new neighborhood watch liaison introducing herself and asking if I have any concerns about the community. I reply and say everything is good and I appreciate the outreach. She says the board has implemented new training for all volunteers to make sure everyone understands the standards and the proper enforcement process. She also says if I ever have an issue, I should contact her directly, and she will work with me to resolve it before it escalates. I thank her, and I think about how different this feels compared to Sandra's approach. I also get a thank you note from one of the board members who voted to withdraw the original violation. She says my documentation and professionalism helped the board see the problem clearly and take action, and she hopes I feel like the community is a better place now. I write back and say I do feel better and I appreciate the board's willingness to listen and correct the situation. She says they learned a lot from the experience and they are committed to making sure it does not happen again. The boat stays in my driveway and the cover stays on, and life goes back to normal. I still check the portal sometimes just to make sure there are no surprise posts, but it is mostly routine stuff like pool maintenance schedules and reminders about trash pickup. I see posts from other residents asking questions about the standards, and the new neighborhood watch liaison responds with clear answers and references to the actual sections. It is night and day compared to Sandra's vague threats and confidential claims. I run into one of the neighbors who signed Sandra's petition at the grocery store, and she stops me and says she has been meaning to apologize in person. She says she feels terrible for not questioning Sandra's story, and she is glad I stood up for myself. I tell her it is water under the bridge and I do not hold it against anyone. She says she learned a valuable lesson about verifying information before taking action, and she hopes I know that most people in the neighborhood are reasonable. I say I do know that, and I am happy to be part of the community. Looking back on the whole situation, I realize how close I came to just giving in and removing the cover to avoid the hassle. If I had not taken the time to document everything and push back with evidence, I would have let Sandra bully me into compliance with a rule that did not exist. I also realize how important it is to know your rights and your governing documents, because a lot of people in HOAs assume the board is always right, and they do not question enforcement actions even when something feels off. I still have the binder with all my evidence, and I keep it in my office just in case, but I do not think I will need it again. The board has new leadership, new volunteers, and a new process that seems to be working. I have not had a single issue since Sandra left, and I have not heard anyone else complain about harassment or selective enforcement. It feels like the community actually learned something from the experience, and I am cautiously optimistic that things will stay stable. The boat is still in my driveway, and I use it a few times a month. Every time I pull the cover on, I think about Sandra measuring the distance to the street with her tape measure and her tablet full of neon sticky notes, and I smile because she tried so hard to make my life miserable, and she ended up losing everything. I do not take any pleasure in her being forced out, but I do feel a sense of justice that the system worked, and the board backed me up when I had the facts on my side. I also think about the moment at the hearing when I played the doorbell footage and the room went silent. That was the turning point. That was the moment when everyone realized Sandra was not enforcing the rules, she was inventing them. The look on her face when the attorney told her she was exposing the HOA to liability was worth every hour I spent organizing that binder. I learned that documentation is everything, and silence is not always the best response. Sometimes you have to stand up and show people the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. The standards are still posted on the portal, and I read them every few months just to stay current. The section about boat covers is still there, and it still says covers are permitted as long as they are in good repair and do not display offensive imagery. My cover is plain navy blue, and it is definitely in good repair. I have no doubt that if Sandra had stayed in the neighborhood, she would have found some other angle to go after me, but I also have no doubt that I would have fought her again and won again, because the facts were on my side. I got a message a few weeks ago from someone in another HOA in a nearby town asking for advice because they are dealing with a similar situation. They said they read about my case on a local forum and they wanted to know how I handled the pressure. I sent them a copy of my evidence folder and I told them the same thing Eric told me. Gather every piece of proof you have, get timestamps on everything, and be ready to show that the standards do not support the claim. They thanked me and said it was incredibly helpful. I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that HOAs can be a positive thing if the people running them are fair and transparent. but they can also be a nightmare if someone like Sandra gets power and uses it to settle personal scores or push their own agenda. The standards are supposed to protect everyone equally, but they only work if the people enforcing them actually follow the rules. I am glad I live in a community where the board was willing to listen and correct the problem, but I know not every HOA is like that. I still see the for sale sign at Sandra's old townhouse, and I wonder if it is still on the market or if someone already bought it. Part of me hopes the new owners are the kind of people who will keep their heads down and follow the rules without causing drama. Another part of me hopes they are the kind of people who will stand up if the board ever tries to pull something shady again, because a community is only as strong as the residents who are willing to hold leadership accountable. I do not regret moving to Meadow Terrace even with everything that happened. I like the amenities, I like most of the neighbors, and I like having a place to park my boat without worrying about street parking or storage fees. The experience with Sandra was awful, but it also taught me a lot about how to navigate conflict and how to protect myself when someone is coming after me with bad intentions. I am more confident now, and I know I can handle whatever comes next. The last thing I will say is that if you are in an HOA and you feel like you are being targeted or harassed, do not assume you are powerless. Read your governing documents, document everything, get timestamps, and do not be afraid to push back if the facts are on your side. The board works for the residents, not the other way around, and if they are not following their own rules, then you have every right to call them out. It might be uncomfortable and it might take time, but it is worth it to stand up for yourself and make sure the system works the way it is supposed to. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.